had spent my whole life believing in fairy tales, the kind where love conquers all, where the right person comes along and makes everything in the world feel just right. And for a long time, I thought I had found that kind of love. I thought I had found my forever. His name was Daniel, and from the moment we met, everything seemed to click. He was charming, kind, and knew exactly how to make me feel special. He wasn't just my fiancé. He was my best friend, my safe place, my home. For months, I had been planning our wedding with the kind of excitement that little girls dream about. The perfect dress, the flowers, the way he would look at me when I walked down the aisle. Every little detail was coming together, and in just a few hours, I was supposed to become Mrs. Daniel Carter. I had no doubt in my mind that this was the happiest moment of my life. But happiness has a cruel way of slipping through your fingers just when you think you have it all. The night before the wedding, my bridesmaids had convinced me to take a break from all the stress and celebrate my last night as a single woman. "Let's go out," they said. "Just a little fun before you officially become a married woman." It sounded harmless. A few drinks, some laughter, and a night of reminiscing about all the memories that had brought me here. I had no idea that the night would end with my entire world crashing down. As the night went on, I started feeling restless. Maybe it was just nerves, or maybe it was something deeper, an instinct I didn't understand yet. I told my friends I needed some air and stepped outside. But instead of heading home, I found myself walking toward Daniel's place. I knew I wasn't supposed to see him before the wedding, but something inside me just wanted to. Maybe I wanted reassurance, a reminder that everything was real and perfect. When I reached his apartment, the lights were still on. I smiled to myself. Maybe he couldn't sleep either. Maybe he was just as excited as I was. I pushed open the door, ready to surprise him with a kiss, with whispered promises of forever. But nothing could have prepared me for what I saw. There, in our bedroom, the room that was supposed to be ours, was Daniel. And he wasn't alone. The air was sucked out of my lungs. My hands started shaking. For a moment, my brain refused to process what my eyes were seeing. I wanted to believe I was dreaming, that I had somehow walked into a cruel nightmare. But nightmares weren't supposed to feel this real. And the worst part? The woman in his arms wasn't just some stranger. It was Olivia, my best friend. The same Olivia who had helped me pick out my wedding dress. The same Olivia who had sworn she would stand by my side as I said my vows. The same Olivia who had told me just hours ago how happy she was for me. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't even move. I just stood there, watching as my perfect love story shattered into a million unrecognizable pieces. It wasn't until Daniel saw me that reality hit. His face turned pale, his mouth opened like he wanted to say something, but no words came out. Olivia gasped, pulling the sheets around herself like it would somehow erase what I had just seen. I didn't need to hear their excuses. There was nothing they could say that would make any of this better. My heart wasn't just broken, it was destroyed. I walked out. I don't remember how I got home. I don't remember if I cried, if I screamed, if I collapsed into myself. All I remember is the numbness. The empty, hollow feeling that took over my entire body. I had spent years loving a man who clearly never loved me the same way. I had trusted a best friend who had been betraying me behind my back. And just like that, everything I had planned for the future was gone. The next morning, I woke up to dozens of missed calls and texts. Apologies, explanations, pleas for forgiveness. None of them mattered, because I had made a decision. I wasn't going to be the heartbroken girl who locked herself in her room, crying over a man who didn't deserve her. I wasn't going to waste another second mourning something that was never real to begin with. I was going to do something crazy, something reckless, something that would make sure I never looked back. I was going to marry the first man I saw. Whoever it was, whatever happened, it didn't matter. Because if love wasn't real, if trust was just a lie, then why should I wait for something that didn't exist? And as I stepped outside, my heart pounding in my chest, I knew one thing for certain. Whoever crossed my path next was about to become my husband. What happens next? Well, let's find out. The moment I stepped outside, the morning air hit me like a wave of reality. The world was still moving, completely unaware that mine had just fallen apart. People were walking by, laughing, drinking coffee, heading to work, living their ordinary lives. And here I was, standing on the sidewalk in the same clothes I had worn the night before, my heart still aching from the betrayal I had witnessed. For a split second, I hesitated. Was I really going to do this? Marry a complete stranger? It was insane. Completely ridiculous. But then I thought about Daniel, about Olivia, about the way my whole life had been planned out so perfectly only for it to crash down in an instant. Maybe life wasn't about planning. Maybe it was about doing something so unexpected, so shocking that it forced you to move forward. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. This was it. The first man I saw would be my husband. No second thoughts. No turning back. And then, as if fate was playing its own cruel joke, I saw him. He wasn't anything like I had imagined. I had expected some random stranger in a business suit, maybe a shy guy walking his dog, or a tourist lost in the city. But instead, he was tall, broad-shouldered, with a rugged kind of look, like he didn't care much about appearances. His dark brown hair was slightly messy, and he looked half asleep, holding a cup of coffee in one hand while scrolling through his phone with the other. He wore a plain t-shirt and jeans, his sneakers slightly worn out, like he'd been through too much life to care about buying new ones. I don't know what made me walk up to him. Maybe it was the exhaustion in his eyes, the kind that mirrored my own. Maybe it was the way he didn't look like the kind of guy who had ever broken a heart before. Or maybe it was just pure recklessness. "Hey," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. He looked up, surprised, his eyes meeting mine for the first time. They were dark, unreadable, but something about them felt safe. Like he wasn't the kind of person who would lie to you. Hey." His voice was deep, slightly raspy, like he had just woken up. "I didn't waste time. I need to get married. Right now. And I want you to be my husband." He blinked, stared at me, then laughed. "Okay, either I'm still asleep or this is the weirdest pickup line I've ever heard." "I'm serious," I said, crossing my arms. "I got betrayed. My ex-fiancé cheated on me. With my best friend. My wedding is supposed to be today. Everything is already planned. The venue, the guests, the dress, everything. And I refuse to let them take this day from me." His amusement faded slightly and something in his expression shifted. "Wait, you're serious?" "Completely." He let out a low whistle, running a hand through his hair. "And you just picked me? Just like that?" I nodded. "You're the first guy I saw." He exhaled, looking at me like he was trying to figure out if I was crazy or just really, really hurt. "That's one hell of a rebound." "It's not a rebound," I corrected. "It's a statement." He studied me for a long time. Most people would have walked away by now. Most people would have laughed and told me to get a grip. But he didn't. "What's your name?" he finally asked. "Emma." He nodded slowly. "I'm Jake." "Nice to meet you, Jake." I extended my hand. "Will you marry me?" For a second, I thought he was going to walk away. I wouldn't have blamed him. But then, to my complete shock, he shook my hand. "All right, Emma," he said, a small smirk playing at his lips. "Let's get married." I should have been relieved, maybe even excited. But as we stood there, shaking hands like we had just made a business deal instead of agreeing to something that would change both of our lives forever, I couldn't help but wonder, who was Jake, and why on earth had he agreed to this? We walked in silence for a while, heading toward the courthouse. Every few steps I could feel him glancing at me like he was still trying to process what was happening. I didn't blame him. Even I couldn't process what was happening. So he finally said, breaking the silence, "Since we're about to be husband and wife, maybe you should know a little about me." I nodded, curious. "All right, tell me something." He shrugged. "I work in construction. Nothing fancy, just building stuff. I used to be in the military, but I got out a few years ago. Now I just try to keep my life as simple as possible." That last part made me laugh. "And yet here you are, about to marry a total stranger." "Yeah," he admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. "Not exactly what I planned when I woke up this morning." "Then why did you say yes?" He thought about it for a moment, his face unreadable. "Because I know what it's like to have life throw something unexpected at you. And sometimes the best way to fight back is to do something just as unexpected." Something about his words hit me harder than I expected. There was something deeper behind them, something I didn't understand yet. But before I could ask more, we arrived at the courthouse. We stepped inside, the cool air making me shiver. The woman at the desk looked up bored, her eyes scanning us like we were just another couple rushing into marriage for all the wrong reasons. "How can I help you?" she asked. Jake glanced at me, then back at the woman. "We want to get married." She didn't look surprised. She probably saw people like us all the time, people desperate for something, running from something. She nodded, pulling out some forms. "You'll need to fill these out." I took the paperwork, my hands slightly trembling. Was I really doing this? Was this really happening? I felt Jake's gaze on me, steady and calm. You sure about this? I met his eyes, and for the first time since last night, I didn't feel completely lost. I didn't feel like a woman whose whole world had been shattered. I felt like someone making a choice. A crazy, reckless choice. But still, a choice. Yes, I said firmly. I'm sure. He nodded. Then let's do this. And just like that, the paperwork was signed. The rings were placed. The vows, short and emotionless, were exchanged. In less than an hour, I went from a heartbroken woman with a ruined wedding to a wife. Mrs. Emma, whatever Jake's last name was. I barely knew the man I had just married. And yet, as we stepped outside, the marriage certificate in my hand, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Of what? I had no idea. But I was about to find out. The moment we stepped outside the courthouse, a strange silence settled between us. The weight of what we had just done finally hit me. I had walked in a single woman, broken and betrayed, and walked out married to a man I knew nothing about. I stared down at the marriage certificate in my hands, the ink still fresh, my name now permanently attached to someone else's. Jake stood beside me, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. He didn't look nervous, but he didn't look particularly thrilled either. He was just calm. Like this was just another thing he had accepted without overthinking it. I let out a shaky breath. So, what now? Jake glanced at me, raising an eyebrow. I guess that depends on you. You were the one who wanted to do this. You tell me what now. I hadn't thought this far ahead. Marrying a stranger had been a bold, impulsive decision, but I hadn't considered the aftermath. Were we supposed to just go our separate ways and pretend this never happened? Or were we supposed to act like husband and wife now? I had no idea what I wanted. Honestly, I said, I have no clue. He smirked slightly, shaking his head. Well, that makes two of us. The realization was starting to settle in. People didn't just get married on a whim and move on with their lives like nothing happened. There were legal documents, responsibilities, expectations. I had been so focused on proving a point to myself that I hadn't considered what came next. Jake must have noticed the panic creeping into my expression because he sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. Look, I get it. This was crazy. You don't have to pretend like this is normal. But if you want, we can figure it out as we go. I hesitated, unsure of what figuring it out even meant. You're not freaking out about this? Jake let out a short laugh. Oh, I'm definitely freaking out. I just don't show it as much as you do. That made me laugh, even if it was brief. There was something about him, something steady, even in the middle of absolute chaos. It was oddly reassuring. I didn't want to go home. My apartment was filled with wedding decorations, untouched seating charts, and a dress that would never be worn. The idea of stepping back into that space made my stomach twist. Can we go somewhere? I asked. Anywhere but home? Jake studied me for a moment, then nodded. Yeah, I know a place. He led me to his truck, and I climbed in without asking where we were going. I wasn't sure why I trusted him, but I did. Maybe it was because, at this point, I had nothing left to lose. The drive was quiet, but not uncomfortable. I kept stealing glances at Jake, trying to piece together who he was. I still couldn't understand why he had agreed to this. Most men would have laughed in my face. Most men would have run. After about 30 minutes, we pulled up to a small diner on the side of the road. It was the kind of place that probably hadn't changed in decades. Red vinyl booths, an old jukebox in the corner, the smell of fresh coffee and bacon lingering in the air. Jake pushed open the door, and the bell above it jingled. A woman behind the counter looked up, her face lighting up when she saw him. Well, if it isn't Jake Thompson. Haven't seen you in a while. I froze slightly. Thompson. So that was his last name. Jake gave her a nod. Hey, Carol. Thought I'd stop by. Carol's gaze drifted to me, and I could see the curiosity in her eyes. And who's this? Before I could answer, Jake spoke. This is Emma. He hesitated for half a second before adding, my wife. Carol's eyes widened, and then she let out a laugh. Your wife? Oh, now this I gotta hear. Jake just shrugged, like this was nothing out of the ordinary. Long story. Carol shook her head, still grinning, and gestured for us to sit. Well, you two get comfortable. I'll get you some coffee and let you figure out how to explain this mess. We slid into a booth, and I leaned forward, lowering my voice. You didn't even flinch when you said that. Jake took a sip of water, his expression unreadable. Didn't see the point. You are my wife now. The way he said it sent a strange shiver down my spine. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't playful. It was just a fact. Carol returned with 2 cups of coffee and a knowing smirk. All right, newlyweds, tell me the story. I wasn't sure how much to say, but before I could figure it out, Jake surprised me. Emma got stood up at her own wedding, so she decided to marry the first guy she saw. Carol raised an eyebrow, clearly waiting for the punchline. When she realized Jake was serious, her mouth dropped open slightly. You're kidding. Nope, Jake said, taking a sip of coffee like he was discussing the weather. Carol turned to me, her expression shifting from shock to something softer. Sweetheart, are you okay? The kindness in her voice almost undid me. For hours, I had been running on adrenaline, pushing my emotions aside, pretending like I was fine. But I wasn't fine. I had been humiliated, betrayed, abandoned. And now, I was sitting across from a stranger who was somehow my husband, pretending like this was just another day. I forced a smile. I will be. Carol didn't push, but she gave me a look that said she knew I was barely holding it together. She sighed and patted my hand. Well, if you ever need to talk, I make a mean apple pie and an even better whiskey coffee. I nodded, appreciating the offer. As Carol walked away, Jake set his cup down and leaned back. So, what do we do now? I exhaled slowly. I don't know. He studied me for a moment before speaking again. Look, I'm not going to push you to figure this out today. We can take it slow. Maybe we just stay married for a while and see what happens. I frowned. Stay married? Jake shrugged. Why not? We're already in this mess. Might as well see where it goes. I stared at him, trying to figure out if he was serious. And then, to my own surprise, I found myself nodding. Okay, I said quietly. Let's see where this goes. The words left my lips before I could overthink them, because deep down I had a feeling this was only the beginning. For the next few days, everything felt surreal. I kept waiting to wake up from this strange, impulsive decision, but every morning, I opened my eyes and found myself in Jake's small, modest apartment, sleeping on the couch because we were still figuring out whatever this marriage even meant. Neither of us talked much about what came next. It was easier to just exist in this strange, in-between space where we weren't strangers anymore, but we weren't exactly a real couple either. Jake was impossible to read. He didn't ask me about my past, didn't pry into my emotions, and never once made me feel like I was an inconvenience. He just let me be. And somehow that was more comforting than anything else. I had spent so much of my life planning, worrying, trying to make everything perfect. But with Jake, there were no expectations, no pressure, just 2 people caught in a mess that neither of us fully understood. But even though I tried to ignore it, the reality of my past was still lingering. My phone buzzed constantly, messages from people who had attended the wedding that never happened, messages from Daniel, messages from Olivia. I ignored them all, but the weight of them was always there. I knew I couldn't hide forever. One evening, while Jake was in the kitchen making coffee, I finally opened one of Daniel's texts. Daniel, Emma, please. Just talk to me. I can explain. I stared at the words, anger and disbelief churning inside me. Explain? What was there to explain? I had seen everything with my own eyes. There was no excuse that could undo what had happened. I tossed my phone onto the table, exhaling sharply. You all right? Jake's voice pulled me back to reality. I looked up at him. He was standing by the counter, his arms crossed, watching me carefully. He had this way of looking at me that made me feel like he saw everything I was trying to hide. I debated lying, telling him I was fine. But what was the point? He already knew I wasn't. Daniel keeps texting me, I admitted. He wants to talk. Jake didn't react much. He just nodded, setting his coffee down. Are you going to? I shook my head. No, he didn't push. He just studied me for a moment before nodding. All right, that was it. No judgment, no questions. Just quiet understanding. But the past had a way of catching up to you whether you wanted it to or not. And mine came crashing back at the worst possible time. 2 days later, I was walking back to Jake's apartment after grabbing groceries when I saw him. Daniel. He was standing outside the building, waiting for me, my stomach clenched, my pulse speeding up. Part of me wanted to turn around and run, but I was tired of running. He spotted me immediately, his face lighting up with relief. "Emma," he breathed, taking a step closer. I held up a hand, stopping him in his tracks. "What are you doing here?" My voice was sharp, unsteady. "I had to see you," he said, his tone urgent. "You won't answer my calls. You won't talk to me. I need you to hear me out." I clenched my jaw. "Hear you out?" "Daniel, I caught you." There's nothing left to say. His face twisted in frustration. "It's not what you think." I let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, really?" "Because it looked exactly like what I think." He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "It was a mistake, Emma. A stupid, meaningless mistake. I was drunk, and Olivia," he stopped, shaking his head. "It just happened. But I love you. You're the only one I've ever wanted." A cold, hollow feeling settled in my chest. His words might have meant something once, but now they were nothing more than empty excuses. "I don't care," I said quietly. "I don't care how it happened. You made your choice, Daniel, and I made mine." His brows furrowed. "What does that mean?" I hesitated. This was it. The moment I had been dreading. But I wasn't going to hide it. "I got married," I said, my voice steady. "To someone else." For a second, he just stared at me, like the words hadn't fully processed. Then his face darkened. "You're lying." I crossed my arms. "I'm not." He let out a disbelieving laugh. "Emma, come on. You expect me to believe that? You got married just like that?" "Yes," I said simply. His jaw clenched. "To who?" "Me." The voice came from behind me, and I turned to see Jake standing in the doorway of the building, his expression calm but unreadable. He stepped forward, slipping an arm around my waist like it was the most natural thing in the world. Daniel's eyes flickered between us, disbelief written all over his face. "You're joking." "No joke," Jake said, his tone even. "She's my wife now." The words hit Daniel like a punch to the gut. His hands curled into fists at his sides. "This is insane," he muttered. "You don't even know him." "That didn't stop you from throwing away years of our relationship in one night," I shot back. Daniel's face twisted with frustration, but before he could say anything else, Jake spoke. "I think we're done here," he said, his voice laced with quiet authority. "She's made her choice. It's time you accept that." Daniel's eyes locked onto mine, and for a split second, I saw something that almost looked like regret. But regret wasn't enough. It would never be enough. Without another word, he turned and walked away. The moment he was gone, my entire body sagged with exhaustion. Jake glanced down at me. "You okay?" I nodded slowly. "Yeah, just tired." He studied me for a second before sighing. "Come on, let's get inside." We walked back to his apartment, and the second we stepped inside, I felt like I could finally breathe again. Jake pulled away, shoving his hands in his pockets. "You all right?" I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, I realized how much he had done for me. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't signed up for my mess. But somehow he had become my shield, my quiet protector in a situation that should have broken me. I swallowed hard. "Thank you," I said softly. He held my gaze for a long moment before nodding. "Anytime." Something shifted between us then. Something I couldn't quite name. And for the first time since this whole thing started, I wasn't just thinking about running away from my past. I was thinking about what came next. With him. The night after Daniel's visit, I barely slept. Even though I had stood my ground and told him it was over, something about the encounter left me unsettled. Maybe it was the way he had looked at me, like he wasn't just hurt, like he was angry, like he wasn't going to just let this go. I tried to push the thought aside as I lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling. Across the room, Jake sat in the armchair, scrolling through his phone. We had fallen into an odd rhythm, coexisting in the same space, sharing conversations that danced around personal details without ever diving too deep. But something about tonight felt different. "You're overthinking," Jake said suddenly, not looking up. I blinked. "What?" He smirked slightly, still focused on his phone. "I can hear it. The way you keep shifting, sighing. You're overthinking." I rolled my eyes. I didn't realize thinking was a crime. It's not, he said, finally glancing up at me. But it won't change anything. I exhaled sharply. So what? I just pretend Daniel never showed up? Jake leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. You don't have to pretend. But don't let him live in your head rent-free. I wanted to argue, but he wasn't wrong. I need to pick up some stuff from my apartment. For a second, he hesitated, then stood up and grabbed his jacket. I'll come with you. I frowned. You don't have to do that. I know, he said simply, but I'm going to. I didn't argue. Part of me was relieved he was coming. The drive to my apartment was quiet, but not uncomfortable. When we pulled into the parking lot, I felt my chest tighten. The last time I had been here, I was still planning a wedding. Still thinking I had a perfect life. I took a deep breath and stepped out of the car. Jake followed, his presence solid and steady beside me. The moment we reached my door, I froze. Something was wrong. The lock, it was broken. My pulse spiked. I reached for the handle, pushing the door open slowly. The second I stepped inside, my stomach dropped. The place was a wreck. Drawers pulled out, clothes scattered across the floor, picture frames smashed. Someone had been here. Jake cursed under his breath. Stay here. But I didn't listen. I stepped inside, my hands shaking. I scanned the room, trying to process the mess. My wedding dress, still hanging in the closet the last time I was here, was now lying on the floor, shredded. My heart pounded. This wasn't random. Someone had done this to hurt me. And I already knew who. Jake exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. Daniel. It wasn't a question. He knew as well as I did. I swallowed hard. He wouldn't, but even as I said the words, I knew they weren't true. Daniel had always been the guy who smiled in public, who knew the right things to say, who made people believe he was the perfect man. But behind closed doors, he hated losing. He hated being embarrassed. And I had embarrassed him in the worst possible way. Jake knelt by the torn dress, his jaw tight. He's trying to scare you. It was working. I wrapped my arms around myself. What do I do? Jake stood, his gaze locking onto mine. You're not staying here. That's not even a question. I hadn't planned to. My apartment didn't feel like home anymore. Felt like a crime scene. I nodded slowly. Okay. Jake exhaled, his shoulders relaxing slightly. All right, let's grab whatever you need and get out of here. I packed quickly, shoving essentials into a suitcase, trying not to think about the fact that this wasn't just a one-time thing. This was my life now. A life where my ex-fiancé was no longer just someone I had left behind. He was a threat. As we left the apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. And I was right, because when we got back to Jake's place, there was an envelope taped to the door. I felt my stomach drop as I pulled it off, my fingers shaking slightly. Jake stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. What is it? I slowly opened it, pulling out a single piece of paper. My breath caught in my throat as I read the words written in bold. Black ink. This isn't over. Jake snatched the note from my hands, his jaw tightening as he read it. His eyes darkened, his entire body going rigid. A cold fear curled in my stomach. Daniel wasn't letting go. And now I wasn't just trying to move on. I was trying to stay safe. Jake's grip on the note tightened, his knuckles turning white as he read the message over and over again. His jaw was clenched, and for the first time since I had met him, I saw something close to real anger in his eyes. Not just annoyance or frustration, but a deep, protective kind of anger. The kind that told me he wasn't going to let this slide. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing. He's not going to stop, is he? Jake exhaled through his nose, his fingers smoothing out the crumpled paper before tossing it onto the counter. No, but that doesn't mean we let him win. I felt my stomach twist. Jake, what if this gets worse? He looked at me then, his dark eyes steady. Then we handle it. His certainty should have reassured me, but the fear curling in my chest didn't go away. Daniel wasn't just trying to scare me, he was proving a point. That no matter what I did, no matter how far I tried to run, he would always be there, waiting, watching. I had spent my whole life thinking Daniel was charming, dependable, the kind of man who would never lose control. But I had been wrong. So wrong. The next morning, I woke up to my phone buzzing. A text from an unknown number. You really think you can just disappear? I know where you are, Emma. And I'm coming. My heart stopped. I bolted upright, my hands trembling as I reread the message. Jake was still asleep in the armchair, his arms crossed, breathing steady. He had stayed up late, probably making sure I felt safe, and now exhaustion had finally caught up with him. I didn't wake him. Instead, I grabbed my phone and walked to the kitchen, my mind racing. Daniel was coming. I didn't know when, I didn't know how, but I knew I couldn't just sit here waiting for him to show up. My whole life, I had let other people control the narrative. Daniel, Olivia, everyone who had ever told me how my life was supposed to go. But not anymore. I wasn't going to be afraid. I wasn't going to let him take anything else from me. I took a deep breath, then turned and walked back into the living room, nudging Jake's shoulder. He stirred, his eyes blinking open. "What's wrong?" His voice was rough with sleep, but the second he saw my face, he sat up straighter. "Emma?" I handed him my phone. He read the text in silence, then cursed under his breath. He stood up, already reaching for his jacket. "We're not waiting around. Let's go." I frowned. "Go where?" "To end this." Jake wasn't the kind of person who talked just to talk. When he made a decision, he followed through. And right now, he had decided that we weren't running anymore. I wasn't sure what ending this meant, but I knew one thing: whatever happened next, I wasn't facing it alone. We drove in silence, the tension thick between us. I didn't have to ask where we were going. I already knew. Daniel's apartment. Jake parked the truck outside, turning to me before getting out. "Stay here." I shook my head. "No. I need to do this." He studied me for a moment, then nodded. We walked up the steps together, my heartbeat pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. When we reached Daniel's door, Jake knocked hard. A few seconds passed. Then the door opened. Daniel stood there, his expression unreadable. He looked composed. Too composed. Like he had been expecting this. "Emma," he said smoothly, his eyes flickering between me and Jake. "Didn't think I'd see you so soon." My stomach churned. "I got your message." He smirked. "I figured you would." Jake stepped forward slightly, his presence solid beside me. "Enough with the games. This stops now." Daniel chuckled, leaning against the doorframe. "Or what? You think you can scare me?" Jake didn't flinch. "I don't need to scare you, but I can make sure you never come near her again." Something flickered in Daniel's eyes then. Not fear, but something close to it. Annoyance. Realization. He wasn't in control of the situation anymore. He exhaled, shaking his head. "You think this is about you, Jake?" He looked at me then, his gaze sharp. "Emma, you don't even know who you married." My breath caught in my throat. "What?" Jake stiffened beside me. Daniel's smirk grew. "You think he's your hero? Your protector?" He let out a low laugh. "Ask him why he really said yes. Ask him what he's not telling you." I felt cold all over. I turned to Jake, my voice barely a whisper. "What is he talking about?" Jake's jaw clenched, his entire body going rigid. He didn't look at me. He just kept his eyes locked on Daniel. But that silence told me everything. There was something I didn't know. Something I should have known. Daniel leaned closer, his voice almost taunting. "You never questioned why a complete stranger would marry you, did you?" I swallowed hard. "Jake?" For the first time, Jake looked away. And in that moment, I realized Daniel wasn't the only one keeping secrets. Jake had his own. And now I wasn't sure who I could trust. The air between us felt heavier than it had ever been. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and uneven, as I turned to Jake, waiting for him to say something, anything that would make Daniel's words meaningless. But he didn't. He just stood there, jaw tight, eyes dark with something I couldn't quite read. "Jake," I said, my voice quieter now, my throat dry. "Tell me he's lying." Jake exhaled slowly, like he was choosing his words carefully. "It's not what you think." Daniel let out a low chuckle. "That's exactly what people say when it's exactly what you think." I ignored Daniel, my eyes locked on Jake. "Then explain it to me. Because right now, I feel like an idiot for trusting you." Jake finally looked at me, and I saw something in his expression that I hadn't before: hesitation. Regret. And that scared me more than anything. "I knew about you before we met," he admitted. My stomach dropped. "What?" "I didn't just happen to be the first guy you saw that morning," he said, his voice quiet but firm. I was already watching Daniel. The words barely made sense at first. I felt like I had missed a step in the conversation, like I had walked into a story that I wasn't supposed to be a part of. "Watching him?" I repeated. Jake nodded, his gaze unwavering now. "I have my reasons. But the truth is, I already knew who you were. I knew about the wedding. I knew about him. I shook my head, trying to process it all. So what, this was some kind of setup? No, Jake said quickly. I never planned on marrying you. That was real. When you walked up to me that day, I wasn't pretending. I didn't do it to manipulate you. But I can't lie and say I didn't know about your situation before that. Daniel crossed his arms, looking way too pleased with himself. See, sweetheart? You never really left one lie, you just walked into another one. I ignored him, my chest tightening. Why, Jake? He hesitated again. Because Daniel isn't who he pretends to be. And I wasn't the only one who knew it. A sinking feeling settled in my gut. What are you saying? Jake looked at Daniel, his expression unreadable. You want to tell her, or should I? Daniel's smirk faltered just slightly. Jake turned back to me. Daniel's been in trouble before. The kind of trouble that doesn't just go away. You think this whole mess is about a broken engagement? It's not. He was desperate to keep you around because you made him look clean. The perfect fiancé. The perfect guy. But the moment you walked away, he started slipping. I stared at Daniel, searching for any sign that Jake was lying. But for the first time, Daniel didn't look amused. He looked angry. You don't know what you're talking about, Daniel muttered. Jake tilted his head. Don't I? The silence stretched between them, thick and charged. I suddenly felt like I had been a pawn in a game I never agreed to play. So what, Jake? I said, my voice shaking. You marry me, what does that fix? He met my gaze. Nothing. But I wasn't trying to fix anything. I was just trying to protect you. The words hung in the air, and I didn't know how to feel about them. Because even though everything felt like it had been a lie, one thing still rang true. Jake had never let me feel alone. Even now, when everything was coming undone, he stood beside me. Daniel scoffed. This is pathetic. You think you can play the hero? You don't know anything about me. Jake took a slow step forward. I know enough to make sure you don't get near her again. Daniel clenched his jaw, but he didn't say another word. He just exhaled sharply, then turned to me. You'll regret this, he muttered. I lifted my chin, forcing my voice to stay steady. I already regret ever trusting you. He stared at me for a second longer, then turned and walked away. Just like that, it was over. Or at least, it should have been. I stood there for a long moment, trying to make sense of everything. The man I thought I had loved was someone I barely even knew. And the man I had married, well, I wasn't sure what he was to me anymore. When I finally turned back to Jake, I felt exhausted. I don't even know where to start. Jake sighed. You don't have to. Not right now. I shook my head. I need to know one thing. He nodded, waiting. I swallowed hard. Was anything real? His expression softened just slightly. Yes. I wanted to believe him. Maybe a part of me already did. The next few weeks were quiet. Daniel stopped calling, stopped showing up. I finally started to breathe again. Started to feel like my life was my own again. But everything with Jake was different. We still lived in the same space, but something had changed. The easy conversations, the quiet understanding between us. It felt heavier now, weighted with everything we hadn't said. One evening, as I was cleaning up the kitchen, Jake walked in and leaned against the counter. So, are we going to talk about it? I didn't look up. Talk about what? You know what? I set the dish down and exhaled. Jake, I don't even know where to start. Start with this, he said, his voice softer now. Do you want to end this? I finally looked at him, searching his face for an answer I wasn't sure I had. This marriage, it was never real. His jaw tightened just slightly. That's not what I asked. I hesitated. I don't know what I want. Jake nodded like he had expected that answer. But then he said something I wasn't prepared for. Then let's figure it out. Together. I stared at him, my heart pounding for an entirely different reason this time. And for the first time since this whole thing started, I realized maybe this wasn't just about what had happened to me. Maybe this was about what came next. With him.